Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today, a reporter based in Minneapolis shares what it's been like covering the federal immigration crackdown. And we'll hear why Wisconsin's Republican-led legislature is getting new constitutional amendments on the ballot, including one about DEI.
Republicans will likely campaign on these issues this fall and hope it helps spark some turnout intensity among their base to help them with the election for governor and to the legislature this fall as well.
Plus, the Trump administration is working to roll back the National Environmental Policy Act. We'll learn what the law is supposed to do.
And that is protect the environment, make sure man and nature work together.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. For weeks, Minnesota has been targeted by an aggressive immigration enforcement campaign. Federal immigration agents have surged through the Twin Cities, going door to door, arresting immigrants and U.S. citizens alike. One woman, Renee Nicole Good, was killed by an ICE agent. So how do you report on something like this? Caitlin Vu is an immigration reporter at the Sahan Journal, an outlet in the Twin Cities that covers immigrant communities. She spoke with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez last week. During their interview, you'll hear clips from news reports about what's happening in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
I wanted to ask you about Sahan because Sahan Journal, where you work, founded, 6 years ago or so, 2019. It's to cover immigrant communities, diverse communities within the Twin Cities. And you are the newsroom's immigration reporter with a direct line to communities of color and immigrant communities. What are you hearing from people in the Twin Cities?
I've been hearing from a lot of folks, mostly fear from immigrants right now, folks who aren't going to work, folks who are staying home. That's causing a lot of problems, I think, with a lot of businesses. Employees aren't showing up, and these families that have children and they are afraid to go to school. And so that's been a lot of what I've been hearing, but I've also been hearing from folks, mostly U.S. citizens, talk about how the organizing that they were so committed to when the murder of George Floyd happened in Minneapolis, they're revamping those efforts again to organize.
Tell us you are going to allow federal tyranny. That's right. We're talking about murder.
So there's been a lot of fear, but there's also been a lot of neighbors coming together to try to hold strong to help support folks that are at risk.
There have been so many stories, too, that have also been coming out that the nation has been following from the Twin Cities. Obviously, Renee Nicole Good and the use of chemical irritants on high school students. I think recently, though, what people have been following is this story of Chung Lee Scott Tao, a U.S. citizen, grandfather, no arrest record,
was led outside in his underwear and a blanket in freezing conditions.
You talked with Tao and his family, and I'm curious about what about his story and arrest stood out to you after getting to know him and sit down with them?
When I spoke with him, it was literally the day after that he was arrested, so he was still processing. But I remember one thing he said that kind of stuck with me was that he wanted everyone to know what happened to him. I mean, I feel like anyone would feel embarrassed being shown on social media half naked, but Chung Lee was telling me about how he wanted everyone to know what federal agents did to him because he wanted others to know what they try to protect themselves and learn about their rights. And he wanted that to be the main message.
It's these moments where I think people really appreciate what it means to have independent outlets like Sahan that are covering the community, that have these deep ties and connections to community. And there are also these kind of informal networks of information sharing that have been popping up all over the place. One story that I really couldn't get enough of that showed this off was the Mamas of Cedar story, and this kind of rapid response network that just organically popped up between these mothers. Can you tell us about them and the work that they're doing in community?
Yeah, well, Binta, she's a reporter that works with us. She wrote that story and she did a really good job. I think she went a lot, she got to know them. And Cedar Riverside is a dense, like, immigrant population. Like, it's really well known that a lot of Somali folks live there who are right now being focused by the Trump administration and targeted by the Trump administration. But Binta was able to write about, why they were motivated to take it upon themselves to keep their neighbors safe. And there's a lot of organizations that are here that do really good work, but I think this moment seems to be a moment where I feel a lot of people are feeling like called to act to protect each other. So I think that's a really good example of something like that.
And on the other side of this, you have the federal government threatening the invocation of the Insurrection Act. There's active U.S. military and their troops standing by for deployment into your state. What are you expecting, if you even can know what to expect from the federal government and ICE?
Yeah, well, I listened to CBP, Customs Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino talk at a press conference in Minneapolis. And he emphasized that they're going to continue to arrest as many people as they can.
We're going to continue to be out in the community, and we're going to continue to conduct that mission, that legal, lawful Title VIII mission. And, again, I've been out with my Border Patrol agents. Marcos is out constantly with his troops. And what I see out there is a very professional, prudent, and thoughtful.
There doesn't seem to be any stopping anytime soon. And a lot of the focus right now is just to walk in front of people in the street and ask them about their citizenship. And that's been happening all over Minnesota. There's not a sense of when it'll slow down or how worse things can get. I think everyone sort of has felt devastated after the shooting that killed Renee. And I think everyone is still thinking about what this moment means for us in Minnesota. But I think that there's been a lot of pressure on our elected officials to help ICE make these arrests. And our elected officials are still headstrong about their values of helping Minnesotans win deal through, this massive force on Minnesota. But I used to think I knew where things were heading in Minnesota, but I'm just now trying to expect anything at this point.
I have to ask, as a newsroom, how do you plan for what's coming next? Obviously, a lot of your reporting has, in the past month and a half, shifted to kind of this like rapid response reporting as well. Still getting out stories that really uplift and shine a light on immigrant communities, but also just the basic day-to-days of ICE actions and how it's affecting folks like Chung Lee or other community members. So I guess, how is the newsroom thinking about what comes next?
I think you said it, like, rapid response is how it's felt the past, I don't know, few months. It's all hands on deck. Like, I feel like everyone at Sahan has touched the coverage of immigration. It's not just me, there's Andrew Hazard, who's been covering immigration at Sahan as well. Joey Peters, Katrina Pross. We're all just sort of activated now to, we have our separate kind of beats, our own areas of coverage, but immigration enforcement is affecting every industry right now, and everyone. I feel like everyone is seeing it happen to their neighborhood, where there's better agents there. So that's been kind of how it's felt. It's like everyone who is part of Sahan is paying attention to what's happening and not waiting to jump on top of doing a story. So carrying that with me in this rapid response time, I guess, it feels like Sahan is really, prepared in this moment to try to help people tell their own version of what's going on.
I think a lot of people in the Midwest also have fear too that they could be next. There have been a lot of conversations in Milwaukee with leaders, immigrant rights organizations, also like journalists and media outlets of, okay, how do we cover this? And for someone who's in the middle of this right now, do you have any advice for people in places like Milwaukee or other Midwest cities? And to go along with that, how do people support organizations like Sahan or other folks organizing across the Twin Cities if they'd want to do that?
Well, I think, I guess going back to the story I wrote about Chong Li, he didn't expect what happened to him to happen, but it happened. And piece of advice that I would have is to think about what to do in a situation where federal agents are going door to door, knocking, and understanding what your rights are in that moment. You have your First Amendment, your Fourth Amendment rights, and you have the right to record so that everyone can be able to actually see what happened.
Stop kneeing him in the face! That's his face! Stop it!
Back up or you'll be arrested for impeding. Back up.
I'd say that to support Sahan, it helps us to be able to tell stories that reflect how immigrants' experiences are like right now. I guess it's always been a big, value of Sahan, where we don't just cover about what's happening, but we cover who it's happening to. That's something I take away with me in every story, is that we're looking for who's impacted, who's a face that can show the real effect of a nationwide policy or headline.
That was Sahan Journal immigration reporter Caitlin Vu, speaking with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez.
This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com. Hi, J.R., how you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Excellent. Okay, so I'd like to start with an important development for ballots down the road this year. Republicans in the legislature approved bills that would bring 2 constitutional amendments onto the November ballot. A constitutional amendment is a formal change to the state constitution. It has to be passed by simple majorities in 2 consecutive legislative sessions, and then a majority of voters need to approve it in a statewide election. What can you tell us about these ballot measures?
There are a couple things going on. One is the message of these bills. Republicans support the measures, and 2, the messaging you might see come fall. What I'm getting at is, so first, one of the amendments would bar preferential treatment or discrimination on things like race, sex, other factors. The second one would prohibit the closing of a house of worship during an emergency, much like what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there's a third amendment that is kind of getting close to going to voters that would bar governors from using partial veto authority to create or increase any tax or fee. Look, Republicans think the public is on their side with these issues, and they've learned lessons from past elections where Democrats, for example, put advisory referendums on marijuana, for example, on the ballot. And they believe it helped drive turnout among non-traditional voters to help Democrats in those elections. Republicans will likely campaign on these issues this fall and hope it helps spark some turnout intensity among their base to help them with the election for governor and to the legislature this fall as well.
So Republicans say that the constitutional amendment about diversity, so that deals with the government being prohibited from, quote, discriminating or giving preferential treatment to groups based on sex, race, ethnicity, things like that. Republicans say that it would, quote, bring merit, fairness, and equity back to the state of Wisconsin. But some advocates point to the fact that the state of Wisconsin and the city of Milwaukee will still see some of the widest racial disparities in home ownership, business ownership, socioeconomic status, and that government-led diversity initiatives are one step to level access. Do Republicans in the legislature contemplate this? Do they have a plan to address this?
They basically want the government to get out of the way and say it's not up to the government to fix these things or try to address them, that it should be about merit and that people should be able to, kind of compete for things on their own. There's, spirited debate on some of those things in the Senate this week. But, for Republicans, they're looking big picture at kind of the push against DEI the last few years, from the backlash we've seen to President Trump running that issue in 2024. And they think the public is generally on their side when it comes to winning those things. And again, that they are looking for things that will help drive their base and get them excited to turn out in 2026.
The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reports that other state legislatures have adopted similar measures as this rolling back of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and that other states have seen reduced enrollment among students of color, a decrease in the number of contracts awarded to minority and women-owned businesses. What do we see as the potential implications or results from a ballot measure like this?
We won't know until if it's implemented and it kind of has its time to work its way through the system. We have seen, for example, efforts to limit DEI at the University of Wisconsin system. That's part of the deal that Robin Vos, Assembly Speaker, struck with leadership a couple of years ago to pave the way for some money to flow to the system. We're seeing legislation flow through both houses right now that would seek to overhaul programs that are geared toward minorities to instead focus on those who are disadvantaged, quote unquote. So we're not sure what the overlap would be or how that would change these programs, but that is one approach that Republicans are taking. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen here in Wisconsin, but this is politically something Republicans think is a winner.
And how realistic is that based on the polling that we see out of Wisconsin? How does this issue play out, like in the Marquette poll or other similar polls?
I don't remember a specific issue that addresses the exact wording of these constitutional amendments, but generally speaking, we've seen that DEI is not that popular with the average voter who's going to turn out in Wisconsin. So the Republicans are making a bet that that's going to continue to hold this fall. Now, the messaging will be interesting. Can Democrats find a message that counters what Republicans are pushing and make the voters think twice about it? I've seen things, for example, that Democrats try to argue that this amendment on, discrimination actually would hurt women, for example, in ways with training standards, stuff like that. I'm not sure how they'd message that, and I'm not sure if that's going to be their focus come fall. Most amendments pass, which put on the ballot. There are only two I can think of that failed in recent years. One was to get rid of the state treasurer's office. There was a concerted effort about that one to push back. And the second one was an amendment that Republicans had pushed to kind of give them say in how federal money is spent. And Democrats effectively messaged that they were going to stand in the way of, getting things done, essentially. And it came back and they beat the amendment. I'm not sure if there's going to be a concerted effort by Democrats to focus on these amendments, to try and message on them with ads, those kinds of things, when their big picture is winning the governor's office, winning the control of the state Senate and the state assembly. That's really their true focus this fall.
This is Capitol Notes. I'm Ayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com. Okay, we'll move on to the fact that it's nice to stumble onto a few extra $1 billion. So estimates from the Nonpartisan Legislative Fiscal Bureau predict that the state will end the 2025-27 budget with a $2.5 billion surplus, about $1.5 billion more than previously expected. What do legislative Republicans want to do with this money? What does Democratic Governor Tony Evers want to do with it? And is there overlap?
Well, for the answer to the last question, not really right now. Governor Evers has been pushing to spend that money on $1.3 billion for property tax relief, to basically do all these things he proposed in the budget last summer that got knocked out by Republicans. Republicans have been kind of downplaying the governor's calls and said, look, if the governor wants to fix what's happened with property taxes, for example, he should join them in reversing his 400-year veto that's going to allow annual increases in the limit how much districts can spend between property taxes and state aid for 400 years. Reverse that, and they can talk about some things. The governor's shown no interest in that. So I don't get the impression there's a giant overlap. Now, if the money sits there, there will be a nice pot of money for the next governor to work with and the new legislature to address his or her priorities. We shall see. We've got about a month left, less than that before the assembly adjourns for the session. People are wondering if there'll be a spending bill that takes some of that money and send it back to taxpayers, which lawmakers tend to do in election years when they have money laying around, like give it back to people. We'll see if anything like that materializes, but right now there's not a big effort that I'm seeing publicly between the governor and lawmakers to reach a deal on how to use that money.
And one of the things that's kind of a glaring contrast to this surplus of money is the Medicaid program in the state. That's the joint federal and state program that provides free or low-cost healthcare coverage to millions of Americans with limited income, including people with disabilities. A recent report from the State Department of Health Services projected a $213 million shortfall in the state's Medicaid budget by the end of 2027. What did they cite as the reasons for this, and what are lawmakers proposing to do about it?
Well, first off, that program is massive, and I don't want to diminish $213 million I certainly don't have in the bank, but it's about 2% of what we're spending in terms of state tax dollars in that program over the 2-year period. That program fluctuates a lot between projected enrollment and those kinds of things. So if we have a bad flu season, for example, I'm not being flippant here, but you have a health scare and utilization could go up, right? If things go well for the year, if the economy picks up, things kind of tamp down. So we've got 18 months at the end of this biennium to know how that fund's going to do. So, but there's greater utilization of programs, higher enrollments, what people were expecting, other things. So that number also isn't factored into that projection of a $2.5 billion surplus because they just don't know what's going to end up in 18 months. There's also a caveat to that surplus that the state of Wisconsin has a thing called a hospital assessment. And basically what you do is you tax hospitals on the revenues, submit it to the Medicaid medical assistance funding formula, and you get more matching dollars from the feds. You then turn around and pump back into hospitals to offset what you taxed in the first place and give them more money while getting a skim, if you want to call it that, for other expenses. There is a question about whether what Wisconsin did is going to be allowed by the Trump administration. If you recall, during the budget process, there was this big kind of final push, get that budget done before the One Big Beautiful Act could be signed into law because it puts limits on states and how they could use that assessment. If our assessment changes are disallowed, according to the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, it could cost us about $800 million over that 2-year period. So, yeah, it's $2.5 billion right now, but you could lose $200 million because of Medicaid costs coming in higher than expected. You could lose $800 million if this assessment is nixed. So now you're talking $1 billion gone, and not projecting that, just saying that that's a possibility, or as we sit here right now, that you got to watch and kind of like keep some money in reserve just in case things go south.
Gotcha. So there's a question about the amount that hospitals pay to the state to help fund Medicaid payments. Sticking with the topic of funding priorities, there might be some bipartisan consensus on how to keep Wisconsin Eye running. That's the nonpartisan Wisconsin Government Broadcast Network. It live streams most major events at the state capitol. It's sort of the Wisconsin C-SPAN, if you will. WUWM uses it to report on the Capitol, along with so many other individuals and organizations who rely on it. What's been the developments there?
Well, we have a bipartisan bill from assembly leaders that would create a trust fund, that the fund would then generate interest that would be given to Wisconsin Eye annually to help fund operations. It wouldn't cover everything, but it would cover a significant portion of it, and then they have to fundraise for the rest. Now, the state's been trying to figure out a way to help fund Wisconsin Eye for a while. In the 23-25 budget, they put $10 million in matching funds aside. The network never applied for any of it. Then in this current budget, they tweaked that to give Wisconsin Eye $250,000 up front, keep the rest in that fund for matching money. Now they would take that remaining money and put in this trust fund and just have it generate interest. So there's still some details to be worked out. The Senate has been waiting for details. Senator Leader Devin LeMahieu said that he has some questions because he gave Wisconsin Eye, or actually the co-chairs of the Joint Audit Committee sent Wisconsin Eye a letter in December saying, hey, we want all this financial information, give it to us by January 9th. They turned over January 21st, I believe it was. Now the network says that it never got the first letter. When it found out about it, it asked for an extension and turned things over this week. But LeMahieu said he wants to go through those records first to kind of see what's there, because he's skeptical of giving money to a group that's not been, in his mind, very transparent. Obviously, Wisconsin disputes that, says it's been doing, and has been asked of it when he gets a request. But there's still some little hang up there on that front. Governor Evers has said he's not in favor of just giving them money. He wants some skin in the game. So will this arrangement, this proposal work with the governor? We'll see. His office told me he wasn't involved in the discussions about this legislation. So there's still some ways to go, but it seems like there's at least some interest in keeping access to watching the state capitol operate for the public. The question, what's it look like, and how's it be funded? For sure, there's still a little ways to go on that.
Does the leadership of Wisconsinites seem to be on board?
Seems to be. They're saying positive things, but again, we're still in the negotiation stage. We're still trying to get final details wrapped up so they know what's going on and can really dig into it.
And is this the first time that we've seen such a bipartisan push for a while? And if so, why did this issue bring Republican Assembly Speaker Robin Vos and Democratic Assembly Minority Leader Greta Neubauer together?
Put it this way, there's often availabilities with reporters before session days. I can't remember the last time that there was a joint one between the Democratic and Republican leader of the Assembly, so that tells you how rare it is. Good question about why this issue, but both sides want access and transparency. What's been interesting is, I talk to people in the Capitol about this, lawmakers, they don't get a lot of feedback from average constituents who are really missing Wisconsin. They get feedback, not to say there aren't people who watch it, but they get feedback from lobbyists and from their staff, because people who are involved in politics use it the most. It's a great tool for those of us who are junkies to watch what's going on, but I don't know how widespread it's used among the 5 million people we have in Wisconsin, right? So it's just not a burning issue for constituents, and if constituents aren't lighting up the phones, lawmakers sometimes aren't in a big hurry to work something out.
Well, thanks for the insights, JR. And as always, thanks for joining me on Capitol Notes.
Anytime.
Just like Capitol Notes, Lake Effect is available as a podcast. That means you can listen when you like. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. Then subscribe, download, and listen on demand. Later in the show, we'll learn about the history of the famous shipwreck, the Edmund Fitzgerald. But first, we'll talk about what it could mean to lose the protection of a landmark environmental law. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. One of the country's most fundamental environmental laws is under threat. President Trump is rolling back NEPA. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA requires federal agencies to consider a project's potential environmental impacts before deciding whether to approve it. The Trump administration claims scaling back NEPA will bring infrastructure and energy projects to life without unnecessary delays. Ron Eckstein is very familiar with NEPA. He's a retired state DNR wildlife biologist who spent his career in northern Wisconsin. He saw firsthand how NEPA helped with management of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Eckstein is also a founding member of Wisconsin's Green Fire, a group that promotes science-based management of our state's natural resources. He joins WUWM environmental reporter Susan Bentz.
What NEPA, really tries to do is disclose the effects of proposed activities and then inform the public of what's being proposed.
And looking at cumulative impacts, right? You want to think
That's very important.
Just not
very
today,
important.
but over time.
Yes. First, there's a proposal. All the national forests in the United States have a legal document called a forest plan, hundreds of pages long, that determines the capabilities of the national forest, what kind of plants and animals live there, and how to proceed to manage those forests. And that's a giant public process. That's hard, and the Schwamigan-Nicolay plan dates from 2004. And with DNR, I was involved in helping fashion that plan. And then under the forest plan, what the Forest Service does is take a big chunk of land at a time. So there's 1.5 million acres in the Schwamigan-Nicolay National Forest, and they take chunks of it, like 10,000 acres here and 8,000 acres there and 25,000 acres there, and do a NEPA analysis, which is an integrated team of foresters, wildlife biologists, forest ecologists, soils person. Some forests have an archaeologist. They have wetland people. And they put together a NEPA document that says this is what we can do to manage this chunk of forest. A whole range of things that's going to be done in that chunk of land. So then they have what's called a draft environmental assessment. It's not an environmental impact statement, which is a giant thing. It's an environmental assessment, which is itself is also complex. And so out comes to the public then. The public and agencies or whoever other agencies can comment on it. And then based on the comments, the Forest Service then makes a decision. And then they proceed to implement that process. I would get involved, and the public gets involved in looking at the draft environmental assessment. And another group that works here in Wisconsin is GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. They're another group that very carefully looks at these documents. And they say, well, over here, we know there's this kind of habitat, and we really wish you wouldn't do this instead. And so the Forest Service can make adjustments to their plans based on that. And in some cases, and this happened in Wisconsin during the late 1970s and 80s, environmental organizations can appeal these decisions and take the agency to court. And here on the Schwamigan-Nicolay, for the most part, those types of activities where an organization has taken the Forest Service to court, they've lost. The Forest Service won, mainly because they have the science and the data behind their decision. So that's the importance of the NEPA process. It helps the public understand what is going to happen on the federal national forest, and it helps the Forest Service understand what the public wants from the national forest, back and forth. And the NEPA process provides that.
Is there a particular issue or time in which you felt, boy, this NEPA is so critical to the health and future of this forest?
Yeah. The biggest decision for the management of the Schwamigan-Nicolay National Forest occurred in 2004. And that's when the forest plan was adopted. We were really lucky in Wisconsin. We had a really good bunch of managers and scientists working with the National Forest to develop a forest plan. My thinking is the Schwamigan-Nicolay plan is a top-notch plan because it takes into consideration all of the different aspects that the public wants from a national forest. So not only timber harvest, but fish and wildlife habitat, watershed, water quality, recreation, aesthetics, wilderness, state natural areas. That was the biggest decision. And the plan did one important thing, and that is decided the forested wetlands. So, forests occur on uplands, dry uplands, different soils. And forests also grow on wetlands, on peatlands and mucklands. And these are where tamarack and spruce and white cedar grow on these habitats. And the forest decided in 2004 that they would not enter the wetlands, leave those alone. So that's a giant step for biodiversity because a lot of the forest biodiversity occurs in wetlands and forested wetlands.
Let's fast forward to today and what's happening when it relates to NEPA.
The new Trump administration comes in. There are two presidential executive orders. One is unleashing American energy on the public lands. And the second is stripping the Council on Environmental Quality from issuing binding NEPA regs. Then the Department of Agriculture which the Forest Service resides in, and the Secretary of the Department of Interior, which is all the Bureau of Land Management land and the National Wildlife Refuge, also issued secretary's orders. These addressed the energy emergency. The other one addressed achieving prosperity through deregulation. Next thing that happened was just recently there was a Supreme Court decision about a proposed railroad corridor along the Colorado River in Utah. It was a unanimous decision, and that decision significantly narrowed what NEPA can do, it can review. That court decision said NEPA, under the law now, not under the administrative rules, needs to focus on immediate impacts and not on broad environmental concerns, such as climate or fragmentation of habitat or downstream pollution effects and things like that. Then the third thing that happened was, based on the executive order, the Council on Environmental Quality said, well, okay, now they're all President Trump's appointees. They said, based on that in the court decision, we're not going to regulate NEPA anymore. We're just going to be advisory.
So is the final piece at this point have to do with what's happening in Congress?
Right. The SPEED Act, currently going through Congress, called the Standardizing, Permitting, and Expediting Economic Development Act, which would change the law. All these administrative things that the executive branch can do are with the rules, how to implement the law. Now, what Congress can do is change the law. It redefines what is a reasonable, foreseeable impact. So climate and habitat fragmentation can't be considered. It bans updated information. So say there's a NEPA document, and then this is what we're going to do, and then suddenly an endangered species is found right in the middle of what they're going to do. Well, the SPEED Act says can't consider that. Once the document is there, that's it. You gotta keep moving. Other agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service, their review of Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service decisions is narrowed. The window for legal challenges of NEPA decisions, or decisions based on NEPA, is really narrowed. It's only 150 days.
Do you have a greatest concern around these NEPA modifications?
Without the SPEED Act, the next president could change all the executive orders and the Council on Environmental Quality and all the things to do with NEPA. But when the Congress changes the law itself, that really is permanent. And it would be very difficult for a different Congress to go back and undo that. They could, but it'd be very difficult. And so our organization, Wisconsin Green Fire, believes that the NEPA process should be able to do what it was intended to do. And that is protect the environment, make sure man and nature work together, and to make sure that people can understand what agencies are doing with their public lands. The bottom line for me is these are our public lands. The public lands belong to everybody. You and I and everybody, those are our lands, our public lands. And we should have a say in how they're managed. And the way we get the say is through a process of determining what's out there, what's the best way to manage, then asking, you think that's right, public out there? You think that's a good idea? And ability, in the end, if there's a dispute between an agency and what kind of management they're going to do, then we have the courts to look at that and make a decision. And the way it's going right now in the future, the NEPA process is being narrowed, and the public won't have as much ability to look at what federal agencies are doing. Where NEPA has been used in our national forest here in Wisconsin, we're the leader in timber production and still haul all the benefits of wildlife habitat, forest diversity, abundant fish and wildlife in our forests. So it's been very successful here in Wisconsin.
Ron Eckstein is a retired Wisconsin DNR wildlife biologist and a founding member of Wisconsin's Green Fire. He spoke with WUWM environmental reporter Susan Benz. Coming up, we'll explore why the Edmund Fitzgerald shipwreck still captivates people 50 years after it happened. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. In November 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald cargo vessel sank in Lake Superior during an intense storm. All 29 crew members on board were lost. The Fitzgerald remains one of the most mysterious and controversial shipwrecks of the Great Lakes. Decades later, the Gordon Lightfoot ballad about it continues to garner public interest in the shipwreck, not just in the Midwest, but worldwide. To learn more, Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski is joined by Kay Dragon, curator and exhibits manager at the Door County Maritime Museum.
So the Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest ship to travel the Great Lakes at the time of her launch in 1958. So to start, can you just share some of the background of why the Fitzgerald was built and why it was so notable?
Of course. The Edmund Fitzgerald was built at the request of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company.
See, but why? That's also a big question. Why does a life insurance company pay to build a boat?
They just saw that the ore industry was getting good, and they were like, we want in on that. So they built themselves a boat. It was their only boat that they ever had commissioned and built, for obvious reasons. But they commissioned Great Lakes Engineering Works to build it out of Ecorse, Michigan, and then it was launched and named after the chairman of the board, Edmund Fitzgerald. At the time of its launching, it was 729 feet long, which was 1 foot smaller than the maximum length allowed by the channels and the locks, and it was 75 feet wide, which is the maximum width that can go through the locks. And at the time of its launching, there were, oddly enough, several omens that people now look back at and say, something should have been wrong. It apparently took Mrs. Fitzgerald 3 tries to break the champagne bottle across the bow. It hit the water wrong and caused a massive wave. And in that startling, a gentleman had a heart attack and died at the launching.
We'll jump ahead here to the main event on November 10th, 1975. What is the significance of the phrase, "we are holding our own," as it relates to the Fitzgerald?
So when the Fitzgerald was making its final trek, the Arthur M. Anderson, a slightly larger freighter, was following about 10 miles behind. They were taking the same route, they were going the same place, and with the weather worsening, they decided to use the buddy system. And so the Anderson kept eyes on the Fitzgerald, and the Fitzgerald tried to keep eyes on the Anderson. There are several recordings of their conversations. At one point, the Fitzgerald said that they lost their radar, they couldn't see, there was some fencing damage on deck, and the Anderson was just there to be their eyes for when they couldn't see. And at around, I want to say it was 7:15, when the final conversation happened, the Anderson went, "Okay, so you're having some problems, but like, how are you doing?" And the captain of the Fitzgerald went, "We're holding our own." And the Anderson went, "Okay, we'll call you back later." And that was the last conversation anyone had with anyone aboard that ship.
To get into never knowing why, and I suppose that's part of why it's still got such a hold on us 50 years later, can you share some of the most prevalent theories as to why this sank?
Top was just general structural weakness from McSorley running it hard, other captains running it hard, which is a little unfounded, but it could be possible. I don't know much about ships, but from the reports that I've read, it seemed in ship shape. Unsecured hatches could have been an issue, but no ship would have left dock with unsecured hatches, especially since they had loaded just that morning. The two that are probably most possible are one called the Three Sisters, which is a succession of 3 very high waves, rogue waves, hitting one after the other, which kind of drove the Fitzgerald down into the lake bed from the surface. Or the one that I personally believe as it seems most possible to me scientifically and the way that the path traveled, was a shoaling, meaning that it hit bottom at some point. At one point in its journey, it passed by Caribou Island, which is technically in Ontario, but Caribou Island has something called 6-fathom shoal at one end, a fathom being 6 feet. So it's 36 feet deep at its shallowest at that point. And the Fitzgerald, when fully loaded, I want to say is almost 30 feet underwater. So any sort of large wave, which they had 30-foot waves that night, could have caused it to bounce off the bottom. If something like that would have happened, it would have snapped a little bit in half, damage along the bottom, and it could have popped the railing, which they did see railing damage, and blow some vents just from air pressure from the inside of the ballast and the tanks itself. So that's the one I believe seems the most plausible.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you can watch a number of documentaries or interviews of people who did dive to the Fitzgerald and all the theories and what they think is the right answer, right? And this is 50 years on, and people may assume like, well, hey, we've developed more technology and analytical tools. How come any new information about this hasn't come out? So can you explain why we can't simply just go back down and explore more?
In 1999, they brought up the bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald. The bells are seen as the heart of the ship. So they brought it up. It is now on display at Whitefish Point at the Shipwreck Museum up there. And they lowered another bell down that has all the names of the men that went down with the ship. After that mission, it was deemed a protected grave site and cannot be dived on, visited without express permission from the Canadian government, which also includes the Canadian government reaching out to the families. Because, like I said, it's a grave site. There have only been 2 bodies supposedly photographed because the rest are in the ship still. So you can't just go down and be like, I'm going to go visit. Because 1, you need the government, and 2, it's really deep. It's over 200 feet down, which I don't know much about diving, but that sounds like a lot.
And with the conditions of the lake, I'm sure those windows to dive safely are only so much too. So you mentioned 29 lives were lost, and when the Fitzgerald is talked about, we just hear that general blanket summary of the crew, but we don't usually get more information about the people beyond that. And your exhibit at the Door County Maritime Museum does detail more about the lives of 2 crew members that were from Sturgeon Bay. There's Oliver Buck Champeau and Russell Haskell. I'd love to learn more about them, so let's start with Buck.
Buck was the 3rd assistant engineer. Oddly enough, Russ beat him out of the 2nd assistantship. He's from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. He grew up here. He went to high school with Russell. And at the time of his death, he had just bought a lake house up on Clark Lake. He had 1 daughter. Her name is Deb. She's still kicking. She's a very funny lady. We've been in contact with her a lot. But Buck joined the world of freighters after he served in the Korean War as a Marine. When he came back, he started working on freighters. He wasn't usually on the Fitzgerald, but when Russell Haskell said, hey, we have an opening, he joined on that way to join his old friend. He was only sailing in November because you made more money in November due to treacherous conditions. Russell didn't have any kids. Russell had 6 siblings, though. He was also in the military. All the Haskell boys served in the Army, all at different times. And his oldest brother, Eugene, actually fought in World War II. But after the war, Eugene was on the Fitzgerald. And he was sailing around, and he's the one that suggested when he left the Fitzgerald that his brother take his place, which I can only imagine how much that aided him his whole life, having offered his place to his brother and then having the ship sink. And Russell still has family in the Sturgeon Bay area. Very kind people.
I know this might be a bit of a tough question to answer as someone enveloped in maritime history and working at a museum, because I'm sure you get, mostly enthusiasts coming in your door. But do you think there's been kind of a cultural resurgence of interest in this shipwreck in recent years? Not just here in the Midwest, but around the world. Why are we still captivated by this event? And, lately I see nothing but memes and reels of the Fitzgerald and, of course, the Gordon Lightfoot song and everything. Like, the Fitzgerald is flooding social media right now.
There's a TikTok account that I watch that every October is Spooky Lake Month, and they always end it with Lake Superior.
I follow the same one. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I love them so much. This is going to sound really weird. The resurgence of vinyl records, because Gordon Lightfoot wrote a hell of a song about it, and it has captured the imagination and attention of anyone with ears. And this was in the 70s, so it would have been on records. Unfortunately, Gordon Lightfoot passed recently. I actually was there for one of his final concerts. He did it up here at the Door County Auditorium. But people love the song. And while there are people in Sturgeon Bay, in Millbury, Ohio, in all of the places where the families are from that remember the people, the rest of us, the common folk, hear the song and we're like, oh, what is that? And then we go down our deep dives and our rabbit holes of the Edmund Fitzgerald and, oh, what happened? And the mystery of it. Everyone loves a good mystery.
The wind and the wires made a tattletale sound, and the wave broke over the railing.
Kay Dragon is the curator and exhibits manager at the Door County Maritime Museum. Dragon spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski last year. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll talk to the new leader of Milwaukee Recreation. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, fellas, it's too rough to feed you.